Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to August AGI Staff Seminar. I'm Dai Biao, the Research Director of AGI and the host of today's seminar. Same as the last seminar in July, today we will continue to use Zoom to hold today's seminar. Today's speaker is Professor Shinji Takagi. He is a distinguished research professor at AGI and the professor emeritus of economics at Osaka University. His field of specialization include international macroeconomics and finance, global and regional economic institution. Professor Takagi taught in Osaka University for 23 years. And he also has very rich experience working for IMF and the Japan government. From 2013 to 2018, he was assistant director of the Independent Evaluation Office at IMF. This is a very important position. Today, Professor Takagi will present a new joint paper assessing the role of the IMF in fragile states. Now, let's welcome Professor Takagi.
Okay, this is a joint paper with two of my colleagues, Charles Collins and Kevin Crook. And this was prepared for and presented at a conference held at Oxford University in December 2018 and was going to be published this spring. But with the pandemic, I'm told that it's going to be delayed till later this year. Now, what this paper does, we do three things. I'm going to explain what dynamic definition is, but anyway, we use a dynamic definition of state fragility to characterize the macroeconomic performance of fragile states, number one. And number two, we use event study methodology to assess the impact of IMF engagement in fragile states. And third, we discuss the challenges facing the IMF in its engagement in fragile states going forward. Now, given the audience we have today, introducing the definition and overview. So I take this opportunity not just to present our paper, but as an educational opportunity, because I think it's an important topic that we need to know. So what are the fragile states? I think in Japanese we use the word zeijaku kokka or something like that. Now, zeijaku kokka, right? Now, in English, sometimes we say fragile states, but an extreme case of fragile state is a failed state, right? But if you look at the list of fragile states, it doesn't include some of the well-known failed states, right? So fragile states may not be 100% identical to failed states, but there is a substantial overlap between fragile states and failed states. Obviously, for any concept like this, there's no universal definition. Each institution has its own definition, and not only that, operational definition typically changes from time to time. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a few minutes. how these definitions change from time to time. Now, sometimes it is thought that it is more correct to use the dynamic definition of fragility. Countries are fragile. What we mean by dynamic definition is that our definition of fragility changes from year to year, right? Because typically what people have done in the past in analyzing the economic performance of fragile states, they had a fixed sample of fragile states, right? And they calculate. Now, this would underestimate potentially the economic performance of fragile states, right? Because fragile states that have exceeded fragility are not included in the sample, right? So maybe in the past analysis have unduly underestimated the performance of fragility. Okay, so what we do is we use a dynamic definition that changes every year so that the sample of fragile states each year is different from year to year. Okay, so that's what we call dynamic definition. So we use a dynamic definition to recalculate what people have done in the past. Okay, how would the picture understanding change? Now, the short answer is it doesn't really change very much, right? Because even if you use the dynamic definition, GDP per capita of fragile state is much lower than the GDP per capita of non-fragile. Okay, so this is now I'm talking about IMF work in fragile states. Blue refers to non-fragile states. Left-hand side is low-income countries, and the right-hand side is middle-income countries. Well, for low-income countries, you cannot see a whole lot of difference between IMF's engagement in low-income fragile states and low-income non-fragile states. But in the middle-income countries, we are talking about countries like Iraq, right? Iraq is a middle-income country. And that would be pretty much the end of my presentation. Typically, okay. Now, the first chart is about the catalytic effect of IMF engagement. Okay. Now, basically, you can think of this as this percentage as the coefficient of a panel regression, right? So panel regression meaning there's the countries and then time, right? Country effect or the time effect, right? So we did calculate confidence interval, and this is significant. Right? I mean, there was just too many lines, so we didn't report the confidence intervals, but these are significant. So the IMF lending and non-lending arrangements. Okay, sometimes IMF comes in with a non-lending engagement because we can't give you money because you guys are too risky, but we help you formulate policy. Okay, so that's a signaling effect, right? The fact that the IMF came in with a program, although no money is involved, it could have a signaling effect. So we considered both lending and non-lending arrangements, right? So that the sample is a bit bigger than 50. Okay. So it's very clear that the IMF does have a significant catalytic effect, right? But only for fragile states, because for non-fragile states, there is no catalytic effect, right? So fragile states, when the IMF comes in, official assistance goes up. In some sense, it's not very surprising, right? Because IMF typically goes into this country as part of an international efforts, right? And the World Bank, the ADB, all these institutions are behind Japan, China, right? All these countries are together, UK, right? United States. And, it was agreement, okay? All right, so the IMF, you going first. will come in later. Okay, so in some sense, it's just describing what typically takes place, right? But still, we quantify. So the conclusion of my presentation is summarized in just one bullet, right? I think it is fair to say, quantitatively, that IMF has been found broadly effective. At least it didn't have a negative effect, right? That's for sure. So IMF didn't have a negative effect. And I think, in fact, it has been broadly effective in its catalytic economic stabilization and capacity building roles, right? I think we have shown that. But this is sort of my commentary on what the IMF should do in the future. But it's not achieving its full potential because it is sticking to its usual standard business model, a short-term focus. There's no dedicated instrument. It's treating fragile states like any other state. You know, there's no special focus on fragile states, using the same instruments to deal with all countries. Okay? And the second, there's a security policy. I mentioned this in the context of TA, technical assistance. Why technical assistance to fragile states is not increasing so much? Well, it's part of its security policy because IMF does not require its staff to travel to risky countries against their will, right? Whereas Japanese government would order its foreign ministry diplomats to go to Afghanistan, right? Against his or her will. And if you don't, you're fired, right? But the IMF would respect the wishes of the staff, so that the tendency is that all these high security locations are not well staffed. Okay. And the third, it's related to this same issue, to human resources policy. And I also mentioned this earlier, right? Because IMF staff, they're humans, right? They want to be promoted. And typically, the promotion in the IMF involves work in highly visible assignments. And maybe the only possible exceptions, you know, in the case of fragile states is when the war is over. You know, when the war is over, there's a lot of attention, right? Maybe you can find people willing to work on those countries. Right? Maybe Iraq, when the conflict ended, you know, United States attacked Saddam Hussein and, you know, Baghdad fell. All right, it's a great place to go, right? You know, but not after a year or so. You know, nobody wants to go to Iraq, right? In fact, there's nobody's going to Iraq. In fact, it is against IMF policy to go to Iraq, right? They invite Iraqi officials to Amman, Jordan, to have meetings, for example, right? But typically, to be promoted at the IMF, you have to work on large countries. You know, in the case of Asia, you know, China, Japan, India, right? Or some of the major European countries, G7, G20 countries. So to work on fragile states is not rewarding, you know. So typically, you know, people of less caliber tend to work on fragile states. Of course, there are exceptions. You know, there are exceptions, always there are exceptions. So these are the type of things we mentioned in the paper, but I didn't talk about that too much in my own presentation. Okay, thank you very much.